there are some flyers for some other events we have coming up, as well as a clipboard that we'll pass around, but we'd like everyone to please sign in. We need to keep track of attendance for accounting purposes since we're serving lunch. A couple of other events taking place today that you might like to know about, and there's handouts up there. We have another talk right at 2 o'clock on corruption in Brazil, dealing with a legal case in Brazil, and that's at 2 o'clock in this building up in 336. Yep. And then tonight at the Marquee Theater at 6 o'clock, we are screening a documentary film about doctors called The Unafraid, and that's also today. That's tonight. All of this is free and open to the public, so we'd love to see you there. So,
hello everyone, I'm Kata Vendin, Faculty Director of Plastics, and I have an honor and privilege to introduce Patrick Eber, who is an assistant professor of history specializing in Latin American intellectual history, who is going to introduce Cassie.
All right. Thank you, Kata. Thanks, everybody. This is a great turnout. It's nice to see everybody here. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce my friend Casey Lurtz today. Casey and I were in graduate school together many a long year ago now. And it's a great pleasure to see her here. To be very brief about some of her many accomplishments, Casey is currently a residential fellow at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, and in the past has been a Harvard Newcomen Fellow in Business History at Harvard Business School. She graduated from the University of Chicago in 2014, and most relevant, of course, to our for our purposes today, she's the author of a very recently published book, came out this April, From the Grounds Up, Building an Export Economy in Southern Mexico, 1867 to 1920, from Stanford University Press. Though she's at Notre Dame this year, she is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins, and I'm so looking forward to hearing about the results of at least a decade of work that comes down to this hour. So look forward to hearing about it. Thank you, Casey.
Thank you, Patrick. And I want to thank Patrick particularly for kind of arranging this, and also to all the folks at Lassie's for inviting me and organizing this. It's the fun thing about being back in the Midwest. It's easier to get to some places around here, so it's really a pleasure to be here today. And what I'm going to do, I know we only have an hour, so I'll talk for a bit, and then I'm really looking forward to questions. A book is way too much to cram into an hour, of course, as kind of we all know how this goes, and especially as Patrick said, a book that started as a seminar paper in grad school and then turned into a dissertation and on from there. So what I will do, though, is kind of give you a broad overview of the book, which is called From the Grounds Up, Building an Export Economy in Southern Mexico, which in general kind of fits in with this larger interest I have in how people kind of who we think of as peripheral, rural, kind of far from the rest of the world are encountering, taking part in and really shaping globalization from forever, but my particular interests are in the 19th and early 20th century. And so in my book, Export Agriculture, which is one of often the first avenues by which people kind of encounter these larger processes of global integration, serves as a means of understanding how those we think of as isolated really constitute an integral part of these global markets and global flows of stuff and money and people. And I argue really that through their active participation in the kind of formation of these new kinds of markets and these new kinds of institutions to serve those markets, people kind of, again, who we tend to think of as outside these, or kind of uninfluential in these systems, really are the ones who make them stick in certain ways. I'm not arguing that coercion and extraction and kind of exploitation don't have a part to do with, a large role to play in things like the cultivation of bananas or sugar or coffee, but rather that there is a parallel set of processes going on in which smallholders, villagers, laborers are also shaping the ways in which they're engaging with the kinds of production we now think of as kind of primarily plantation agriculture. So I'm moving beyond our kind of typical idea of the export boom in Latin America as this era of extraction and expropriation, and and kind of a story that's really been narrated as much from foreign markets as from kind of the grounds on which it's taking place, and thinking on the diversity of actors who really made that process of the late 19th and early 20th century kind of take place. And then what it did in terms of shaping kind of what came after, how the participation of people, everyday people, villagers, shopkeepers, small town politicians, migrant laborers, how their participation and sometimes embrace of kind of some of the liberal institutions of contract law and migratory labor and property law that we think of as really serving mostly the interests of the state or elites, by kind of local everyday people taking these things up, they really entrenched them in the practices that kind of endured even after these economies that were kind of built on coffee and sugar and other export crops tended to crash. The stuff that the institutions that made those work had become a part of people's everyday lives. So I'm going to kind of draw us into the region that I'm working on and then talk about two different aspects, kind of depending on time, that really I feel like are a little bit more salient to kind of ongoing politics today, namely the issue of the border. So the book works through kind of sets up a whole bunch of challenges people see to the integration of this place that I'll introduce you to into the global market, and then kind of each chapter works through the ways that these challenges were kind of gotten around, overcome, not necessarily overcome, but kind of muddled through from the perspective of both elites and kind of popular classes. And the first of those chapters is about the border between Mexico and Guatemala, which has been in the news again lately. And then that also feeds into some stories about land and labor that I'll try and touch on as well. So we're talking about, the region that the book is about is way down here on the border with Guatemala. It's a region called the Soconusco. It's a part of the state, it's a district of the state of Chiapas, which again is part of Mexico. This is one of my favorite maps. It's an agricultural map of the country. And this kind of, the map is from the early part of, the map's from the 1880s. The book goes, as Patrick said, kind of from the 1860s through the 1920s. And you can't see because I put a purple star over it, but at this point this land is kind of marked as uncultivated, not yet productive. And the story that I'm telling with the book is how this place went from being kind of a backwater, a cattle town, a ranching region, if it was anything, but very sparsely populated, to kind of quintupling in size and becoming Mexico's biggest exporter of coffee, which has long been one of Mexico's top five exports by the 19-teens. So how does that happen? This is a place that's really distant from centers of political power, sparsely populated, has no infrastructure, does not have anything that would mark it out necessarily aside from really fertile soil and proximity to the ocean as being a potential site of kind of Mexican kind of modernization in the way that it's being imagined for Mexico City. How does this place come to be one of the most successful examples, according to at least some people, in that moment of what market integration could do for a place like Mexico? And in thinking about this, I'm not the only one kind of in the moment. People were also thinking about this as an example, as a place that kind of, because it was so far away and so sparsely populated and so kind of undeveloped in the 1860s, that if this is a report written by the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Hacienda in this moment, about how these are the things the government has already done for this place by the early 1870s, and if we keep doing things for this place, if we can turn a place like this, a place that is so far away from everything, into a productive part of the global economy, we can do it anywhere in Mexico. That the Soconusco can become a region that is an example for how things might happen elsewhere. That's the language of that moment. My language around picking this region is that in this region we end up seeing all of the different kinds of challenges that face, kind of in exaggerated miniature, that face different regions of Latin America across this region as they, as people push them from kind of the center or from kind of foreign markets to integrate, and as people on the ground try and struggle with what it means to start producing for places far from their kind of home markets and to start producing new kinds of goods. So I focus on coffee. Coffee is the main export of this region, as I mentioned, and coffee, much in the way that the Soconusco can kind of stand in, I think, for a lot of places. Coffee is a crop that can be grown in many different ways, and thus can also kind of stand in certain regards for a lot of different kinds of agriculture. You have coffee grown on plantations, You have coffee grown alongside milpas, you have coffee on small holdings, you have kind of coffee across the spectrum. It doesn't have the economies of scale of certain other things. And so we can see a lot of different kinds of people engaging with this particular crop. And by using this place and this crop, which I see again as kind of exaggerated but nonetheless exemplary, I make the argument in the book that people far from the centers of state power found means both to contest it and kind of use it to build up their own ways of participating in this turn to globalization. So the first challenge that most people wrote to the Minister of Finance about, and this is how he got interested in this place. The Minister of Finance is this man named Matias Romero, who now actually the diplomatic school in Mexico is named after. He becomes an important figure, and we'll come back to him. But people write to him, and he actually at one point moves down to this region to try and be an example of how to be a coffee grower, how to be an entrepreneur in this place. He's really bad at it. He fails utterly and loses a lot of money. But nonetheless, he continues to kind of laud this place and its potential. But people write to him from this region asking for help, initially around kind of figuring out tariffs and who's going to kind of staff the local customs office and things like that, trying to get their kids a job. But then eventually seeing that he's somewhat receptive to this, he's looking for somewhere to invest both his own funds as well as the resources of the government in building this new Mexico. They start writing to him about all of the issues that are facing them. Things like labor, things about the lack of property rights, things about kind of just the lack of infrastructure, how the port is a beachfront, how nothing stops there, how hard it is to get everywhere. But more than anything, they write to him about the border. They write to him about actually the lack of a border with Guatemala. The Soconusco had been an autonomous region. At independence, it got to decide, it and the state of Chiapas were left to decide whether they would join the Central America or they would join Mexico. The Soconusco being kind of closest to Guatemala and always kind of recognized as a separate district, a separate kind of space. It wasn't necessarily an integral part of Chiapas. Sends delegates to kind of this meeting that's happening in central Chiapas to make this decision, and they vote to join Guatemala. The rest of the state, though, votes to join Mexico. And because the Soconusco has participated in this, has sent delegates to this meeting, Chiapas and Mexico say that the Soconusco should come along. Folks in the Soconusco are not terribly interested in doing so, and this is the 1820s. Central governments in Mexico and Central America have other things going on, don't particularly want to fight out with each other over this little tiny region, kind of far from anything that at that point, again, has some cows, has some people, used to be really prosperous on the basis of cacao, but that's been hundreds of years at this point. So they kind of leave it be, and governance devolves to the municipalities. And this holds nominally. Santa Anna rides south, Mexico's 11-time war hero president rides south in the 40s and tries to claim it again for Mexico and declares that this is an integral part of Mexico. Chiapas is definitely a part of Mexico. Soconusco is part of Chiapas, therefore this is Mexican. But nobody actually does anything about this. There's no border treaty. There aren't many border treaties at this point in Latin America. Anyways, most borders are pretty vague. But it kind of gets left, and these maps show us, and on these two we see the Soconusco, we see Tapachula, which is the main city in the Soconusco. Here's it labeled out here as a part of Guatemala. On this map, which is a little bit later, these are both, I think, from the 1840s. This one's a little bit later. We see the Soconusco kind of sticking into Guatemala in a way. It is recognized as part of Mexico, but the way that the map making has been done makes it look as though it ought to be part of Guatemala. But again, this is a thing that cartographers are arguing over. It's a thing that locally hasn't mattered much. It's actually left kind of when your money is in your cows, the land on which they're kind of wandering over doesn't matter as much. You don't need kind of firm property rights. It means that villagers have been able to kind of establish new villages wherever they will, kind of with whether they're born on one side of the border or the other, kind of being able to just meander across and kind of settle their stakes in this land without having to say that they're Mexican or Guatemalan. There's been some benefit for people locally in having this kind of ambiguity over where they live. But starting in the 1860s, Guatemala is having a boom in coffee. Mexico is starting to kind of feel, especially after 1867 and after the liberal triumph of Juarez, is starting to feel kind of like a stronger central state. There is a little bit more interest in having some sort of settled notion of what it is to be the Mexican nation, and from locally in some sort of maybe taking up what's going on across not that far away with coffee and investing in property rights, investing in having kind of your land be your land. Because unlike cattle, which again can kind of meander as they will, and you want to keep track of the cattle, but the land doesn't matter as much, coffee takes 4 to 5 years to become productive. And if you're going to invest in this land, you're going to invest in these plants, you need to know that 4 to 5 years down the line, that land will still be yours. And so property rights become a thing that you want. And if you don't know if you're Guatemala or Mexico, who do you get those property rights from? Who do you reach out to give you a land title? And so locally, this starts to become kind of an issue for elites, even as villagers continue to kind of move back and forth through these spaces, kind of claiming new land for themselves. And Romero, that diplomat, or at that moment, the Minister of Finance I had mentioned, when he moves down here, he himself kind of gets engaged in this whole set of debates. He starts buying a little bit of land or attempting to buy land. It's really hard. It's public land, and the processes by which one buys public land, even if you're pretty sure it's Mexican, are really murky at this moment still, and require kind of writing to officials a week's ride away and all of this sort of thing. But also he finds that he has these villagers who I've been talking about wandering on and settling on his lands. And he is very confused as to what to do with this. He says, this is my land. I'm in the process of properly titling it. What do I do about these villagers? And he writes to a man who is about to become the president of Guatemala, but who is also from this border region, a man named Justo Rufino Barrios, to ask him what to do about this. Because he's trying to buy some land from Barrios, because Barrios has been in this region for a long time and clearly is kind of up and coming, liberal politician, somebody that it would be good for the Mexican government to have a relationship with. This is potentially a way to kind of negotiate this. And Barrios tells him, let him be, that's fine. They can be a potential temporary labor source for you. You're not going to be able to work all this land anyways at the get-go. It's good to have some folks settled on part of it. They're not going to do anything. Don't worry about it for now. This is how you want it to be, actually. That does not, and kind of in the midst of this map gets produced, that this will be a thing we see for the next couple maps, and I don't know how visible it is from a distance, but you produce maps that have multiple borders, that have kind of a variety of things that might be the border. And this is produced by kind of a local engineer who produces a bunch of not quite legal titles for people, as well as drawing up his version of a map of this region. They're locally relevant titles. He's gone out and said he's done a survey of various properties, including for Romero at some point. Whether they count in law is really unclear and doesn't really matter at this moment. But he draws up this map that has this nice red line that this is where the border should be, as far south as we can possibly make it. But based on kind of the local understandings of things, this green line or this purple line, which is on a river, might also be the border. And we're going to kind of leave it at that for now. And Romero's land is like right in here, in this like potentially really vague region, where the local engineer is just going to kind of leave it vague. Barrios is going to say it doesn't really matter. And Romero, being kind of a good state builder and kind of entrepreneur, is getting increasingly concerned about how this might matter, as are a bunch of these other people who kind of follow him and the paths that he creates outward and inward for capital and coffee into buying either kind of trying to buy up land and trying to turn it to coffee. He, as I said, Romero is a failure at this. He thinks coffee ripens in a year. He kind of has borrowed a lot of money abroad and can't actually get it to the region because transportation's really bad. He's just really bad at this. He decides to go back to Mexico City. And as he leaves, kind of this tenuous friendship between him and Barrios just explodes, between him and the man who is now president. We're talking about the mid-1870s of Guatemala, just kind of falls apart. And it falls apart in this really dramatic way where when Romero gets back to Mexico City, it's to news that his plantation has been burned to the ground, that his property has been destroyed by those villagers who Barrios told him would be totally fine. And Barrios has also filed a warrant for his arrest, saying that it was Romero who invaded his lands, that it was Romero who led some sort of invasion of Guatemala, and is the one responsible for all this destruction, and has impeded relations between these two nations, and kind of this thing that had been about locals kind of negotiating over what land rights might look like and how to get access to labor, and well, the border doesn't really matter, suddenly turns into, in the context of two nations trying to kind of start to assert some sort of territorial integrity, turns into a much bigger story. Romero spends the next couple of years writing weekly editorials that are a history of this region that end up being like a 500-page long book about what's going on and why he is in the right. Barrios turns elsewhere for aid in trying to kind of assert some sort of not just Guatemalan national integrity, but to try and reassemble, in fact, the Central American Federation, the Central American republics, as one space over which he, as this kind of grand liberal state maker, is going to take control. And in turning to kind of that project, he finds an ally in the United States. And this is where kind of the not parallels, but kind of the echoes with things that are going on today in terms of the militarization of the border between Guatemala and Mexico to deal with migrant problems really echo for me in a lot of ways with what's happening in this space in the late 19th century and even earlier. Because again, we still have villagers moving back across and forth across this space, finding new places to start farms for themselves, finding some work seasonally or on a regular basis, kind of engaging with this growing coffee economy of the Soconusco, both again as labor as well as starting to be producers as well, as they move up and claim land in the foothills, these villagers, both Guatemalan and kind of from the lowlands of the Soconusco, often encountering kind of this insecurity of property title that Romero had been so worried about and that other kind of other planters had started to be worried about as well. They run into this violence that is increasingly being pushed by Barrios, who is trying to reclaim this as a part of that nation that might be Central America as a whole, which is an appealing idea to the United States because they want to build a canal, because they want a space across which to build another kind of aspect of this integration of the global economy in this moment, which would be a way to connect the Caribbean and the Pacific. And they have decided, kind of folks at the State Department here have decided that Barrios, this kind of nation builder, once upon a time coffee grower, but a real strongman, caudillo kind of figure in Central America, is the person to pacify this region and provide them with kind of the land rights as well as kind of the just stability across which to build this kind of integrating new feature of the landscape. And so Barrios, with the backing of folks from the Department of State, starts pushing for the Soconusco at the least, which is what the United States has promised him in return for this kind of pacified region across which to build a canal, starts pushing for the Soconusco to be, again, a part of Guatemala. And there's a lot more raiding of villages, there's a lot more raiding of fincas, there's a lot more burning of plantations in this moment, kind of going both directions. The violence is not only going northward, and often is as much about local kind of political enmities as it is about anything else. But it is kind of has the backing of this aspirational president, or kind of this kind of strongman president in Guatemala. And the victims, well, kind of coffee plants and kind of elite planters' property is part of it. It also very often involves the kidnapping and raping and sometimes killing of the villagers who have been moving back and forth across this space as well, as temporary labor, as kind of moving into new spaces to find economic regions. And so we find in the papers at the kind of US Senate, eventually on the kind of reporting that happens about this after the fact, the voices translated from Mam or another Mayan language into Spanish, into English, of these stories kind of personal loss, of personal suffering from kind of everyday people who have been trying to make something in this space of ambiguity that had been very useful to them and is now a space that somebody kind of from a distance is trying to turn into a hard and fast border of one sort or another. And those stories they end up at the US Senate because they are the stories that the Mexican government uses to push back against this kind of push northward by Barrios. That the US, or the Mexican government uses its constitution, saying Chiapas is an integral part of the United States of Mexico based on the 1857 Constitution. We cannot negotiate over this space. They use their larger military presence. Kind of a lot of troops get sent south to the border, and there's all sorts of calls in the national newspapers to send tens of thousands of troops south to the border. But they also increasingly deploy the stories of people like the Perez family, who a set of brothers and their wives who were living in this region, who had established kind of a small farm for themselves. The men worked seasonally on a finca. Guatemalan troops rushed in. The women stayed at home to take care of the homes, feeling that they were safe. The men took flight, fearing kidnap, to their seasonal employers on a coffee finca. and the wife was raped and miscarried in this moment. And so that story becomes part of the narrative that Mexico is deploying to push back against these threats of kind of these territorial threats to kind of what is going on at the border and what is going on with the backing of the United States behind Barrios in this particular moment. And so we end up, again, with more maps and more kind of negotiation over what this space might look like. I know you can't read this, and that's totally fine, but there's, I don't know, a dozen different lines up here that are proposed as what might be the border based on mapping practices from both sides, based on potential treaties that have been put forward at various moments. And that this kind of, again, keeps going back and forth using cartography, using some sort of ideas of modern science of the state, but as much as anything using kind of personal narratives, using kind of this moral set of stories about what ought to be the case down here at the border. Eventually, in part due to the assassination of the president in the United States and a changing of the guard at the Department of State, but as much because this moral suasion really works on Mexico's behalf, as does the fact that people find out that Guatemala has in fact decided that maybe it'll give the Soconusco to the United States in return for its aid instead of keeping it for themselves, instead of Barrios keeping this as a part of Guatemala. We'll trade this away if the US continues to back the Guatemalan case. That does not bode well. These stories, filibustering is not that far away, kind of not that far distant. The US-Mexico War is not that far distant. Or the Mexican-American War, sorry, is not that far distant. So this idea that the Soconusco might become a part of the United States is neither appealing to Guatemalans nor to Mexican kind of publics. And so eventually this stalemate, which has involved the movement of a lot of troops to the border region, kind of comes to a head. Barrios gives up on his own Department of State, sails north to Washington, D.C. to negotiate a treaty based on all of these ideas of where the border might be, based on all of these stories that people have locally of which authorities they're turning to, which is something the Mexican government deploys a lot to, that the Perezes were likely this family who lost kind of an unborn child, were likely born in Guatemala, but they turned to the Mexican state for succor in this moment for assistance. Barrios sails north to DC to negotiate the treaty with nobody else except Romero, that initial kind of minister of finance, who is now essentially the ambassador from Mexico to the United States, is living in DC. And they sit down at a table, these two men who had kind of initially been friends and fought over a particular piece of property and the people living on it, and then accused each other of all sorts of things, sit down at a table and negotiate this treaty. And when they negotiate the treaty, they come to an agreement about what the line will be. And it's the Suchiate River, which is a river we've now seen in the news, not infrequently lately, with people crossing it, kind of a parallel story to what's going on at the northern border of Mexico. A border that's now, again, kind of the US government is sending money south to try and enforce this border between Guatemala and Mexico, turn it into a hard line. At the moment, the border is decided, let's see if that's not the border is decided to be this river, kind of closest to the ocean, kind of in this section, the westernmost section of Mexico, and then a variety of points, kind of inland, some based on rivers, some based on other markers, are decided for the rest of the borderlands. It takes 16 years to survey that actual border and to set out the border markers. All along the way, it is local people who are consulted about where the border actually sits, because this is a jungle. We're talking about going through the Lacandon and then the Petén jungles inland from here, where there's not a lot of landmarks, there's not a lot of knowledge, there's been no cartography done, and so people, the surveyors who are out there, and just because I love it, the head of the survey team from Guatemala is named Miles Rock, which I feel like is the best name for a surveyor ever. But they turn to local people and ask, again, the folks who live in these spaces, are you on Mexican or Guatemalan territory? So even if this is a thing signed by two important politicians in Washington, D.C., far from the border, the knowledge that's the stories that have initially been deployed, and then the knowledge that's being put to use to decide where this line will actually be, are in fact the knowledge of those people on the ground. And those people are also left to their own devices when it comes to deciding who they are. The treaty leaves it up to people in this region who are very ambiguous in their citizenship, gives them a year to say, I am Mexican or I am Guatemalan. You can decide your own citizenship in this moment. But then no kind of enforcement mechanisms are put in place by which people have to decide. I've never found anything that is like, you need to go here to declare that you are so-and-so or such and such. And so most people stay kind of citizens of their local villages, of their municipalities.